Says we're good. Thank you so much for for coming tonight. I think this is a great panel that we've assembled, and I'm very excited about it. My name is Andres Martinez. I'm the director of the Bernard Schwartz Fellows Program here at New America, and it's my honor to present and introduce our speakers tonight. Karina Moskalenko is a well-known Russian human rights lawyer. And she is the director of the International Protection Center in Moscow, which was founded in the early 1990s. She has brought a number of cases to the European Court of Human Rights, as well as working within Russia on such important cases as Garry Kasparov's case and Mikhail Khodorkovsky. She is also she was poisoned in 2008 by mercury.
Don't mention that.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's in my...
Yeah,
okay.
Nobody established the facts, so it's too early.
Yes.
Or too late.
Strike that. And we're honored to have her with us. She's also worked on a lot of cases involving journalists in Russia. Michael Posner is the Assistant Secretary of State in charge of the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I knew Michael back when he was the executive director at Human Rights First, although some of us old school types like to still call it the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. They went through a rebranding phase there. And he was appointed to this position just in the last year after the President Obama was elected. And Michael's also actively, he's been involved in academia and has taught at Yale and Columbia Law Schools. Susan Glasser, our moderator for the evening, as probably all of you know, is the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, which we're honored to share space with. They're right upstairs. And Susan was the bureau chief in Moscow for the Washington Post earlier this decade, and is the author in, yes, it was 2005, Susan wrote Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the End of Revolution in 2005. So as our title for this talk suggests, we have an interesting moment of time, as many of you are aware of, in terms of the transition in Russia, as Vladimir Putin and Medvedev are debating amongst themselves the fate of the rule of law in Russia. Legal nihilism, the term that we used in our title, wasn't an exercise in editorializing on our part, although I used to do that for a living. But it's actually the term, interestingly enough, that President Medvedev has used to diagnose some of the shortcomings of the Russian legal system. So without further ado, I want to hand this off to Susan to have a discussion about what's happening in Russia and how it's perceived in the United States and what the West can do about this debate that's happening in Russia. And we're going to leave some time later on for questions and comments from the audience. So thanks again for joining us, Susan.
Well, thank you, first of all, Andres. And I should say that the New America Foundation are the world's greatest landlords, but we're full up, so. No, but it's been wonderful for us at Foreign Policy to not only share space with New America, but really to collaborate in an increasing and interesting number of ways. And, I think this conversation tonight is one good example of that. I couldn't be more excited for the two folks that we have here today. This is one of those ones where I want to hear the answers to the questions as much as I want to do the asking, and I'll make sure that we have a lot of time to engage you in this as well. And when we do get to the questions, all I ask is that we'll pass the microphone around. If you can state your name and your affiliation so people get a sense of where you're coming from, that would be terrific. And for now, we'll be very informal, broad-based conversation. We have two folks coming together in a really interesting way here, I think, for the first time. So, we might start out a little bit with both the big picture of where human rights and democracy promotion fit into the Obama administration's foreign policy on the one hand with Michael, and then also, of course, in the form of Russia, we have this very powerful ongoing case study, and I can't overstate for everybody, just what an incredible figure in Russia today Karina is, and she's literally at the heart of probably all of the major ongoing human rights cases. She's seen things in the last few years, I think, that would be extraordinary to many people here in Washington if they understood what passes for legal proceedings in Russia. That would be a whole different conversation and a very interesting one. But maybe we can just sort of jump in there and talk about, perhaps your most famous ongoing case, which is the case of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who, as most of you, if not all of you know, has gone from being Russia's richest man and one of the richest men in the world, period. Mm-hmm. I think he was the richest man under the age of 40 at one point. He ran the oil company, Yukos. He's been imprisoned for several years now. He's on a second trial. You're representing him in, I believe, 3 different cases before the European Court in Strasbourg. He's also become, in many ways, a very unlikely dissident, if you will. He's been writing a steady stream of commentary and letters from behind the prison walls. And just the other day, he had a piece that appeared in the International Herald Tribune, which I thought I would read a little passage from just to get both of your responses. He talked about, the Russia as it was a decade ago, and what it looked like was very different from what it's ended up being. He wrote, "Today many people recall with sadness that Russia once had a real working parliament where social and business interests engaged in dialogue and compromises were sought and found. They recall how the country's judicial system had begun to feel its independence and how they discovered that they had a civic role to play in the places they called home. There was hope that people in Russia would become active participants in a dynamic, full-fledged civil society. In the international arena, the voice of a new Russia began to be heard, that of a responsible and even benevolent good neighbor. Before us lay a long but well-lit road. But in the years that followed, Russia turned from it. Today, for all practical purposes, we do not have a real parliament, an independent judiciary, freedom of speech, or an effective civil society. The hopes for the formation of a new Russian economy turned out to have been misplaced. Our industrial output, other than raw materials, is not capable of competing, even on the domestic market. Russia's international role has changed drastically as well. Now we are more likely to be feared than respected." And then he immediately pivots to that old Russian question, who is to be blamed? Kto vinovat? I won't ask you that, but I will ask both of you, to start, whether you agree with this characterization of where Russia is at today, and then we'll take it from there.
We start from my opinion. I'm not in a position to generalize. You can imagine that in our International Protection Center, people come only with very, very painful, very political or cases which are sensible to the Russian Federation, but people are suffering a lot from the infringements, many violations. And my view cannot be really very, very balanced, because we have unbalanced situation. People come with their really bad destinies, and if judged on the basis of our cases, it's a horrible situation. But still, I remember that thousands and millions of Russian people remain in their working places. They love their country. They love their lovers, families, kids, and kids are still growing up. But our cases just are very, very dramatical. Even the most, as you said, the richest man is unprotected and hopeless if once the authorities decided to kill his reputation, to kill his firm, oil production. And they managed to do that. And this case is not only the most famous, as you said, but it is the most testing case. And as I can see in this case, and you were right, that there are already 3 cases, Khodorkovsky 1 versus Russia, 2 versus Russia, and 3. And both, all 3 about the really huge number of violations against this person. In some cases, against Russia, you can find violation of 1, 2, 5 rights, but in this case, it's almost all convention. What does it mean? That when the authorities' position in this case is very, really seem like bad, and it would be a finding, I'm sure, of the European Court. And by the way, the European Court findings are very important because all the judgments of the European Court are binding for Russia. It's not a foreign court. It's a court working as much Russian as Italian as Norwegian. And all the judgments have to be implemented. If the person was a victim of unfair trial, then his case has to be retried without the violation.
Is it correct that Russia is the single biggest source of cases, in fact, before the European
Yes,
Court?
this is correct. And partly it can be explained because the very country is very huge, really huge. But also, this is a big disappointment in Russian judiciary, which push people to bring all the cases to the European Court. The European Court is now so popular among Russian people. They think that if they fail to protect themselves in Russia, they can go to the European Court. And this is a very, very effective and easy reachable mechanism. It is very democratic mechanism. This is really the right on individual petition. And sometimes you can find at the European Court, not sometimes, always you can find at the European Court cases on behalf of people who never know. They write their application from prisons. And sometimes they win faster than this, as you said, richest man, because this richest man case is very, very complicated, with many of violations of the convention. And probably we had to reduce this amount of violations in order to facilitate this case to be heard as soon as possible. But we couldn't avoid to mention all the violations, and it is already 6, 7. Almost 7 years he's in prison, and we only have in first case decision on the admissibility, a very important decision, by the way. But this case is not only the most famous, this is a test case. And that is what the human rights community was addressing to Mr. Medvedev when he came into power. They said, if you are a president, and Medvedev has no any reasons to keep Mikhail Khodorkovsky on this absurd charges in prison, and he's not responsible for all this fraud with his company, what the previous administration is responsible, if they are really previous.
Well, I'd love to get you to give the audience a sort of primer on where things stand with Khodorkovsky, what you see as the next big moments in the case. I do want to go to Michael first, and with this question of where does Russia figure into your work at the State Department in terms of human rights, democracy promotion? This is not easy to figure out what role it should play in U.S. policy.
Right. I think Russia is a real test case for us as well. What President Obama has said repeatedly in the last year, Secretary Clinton, is that we're going to approach human rights by engaging in a principled way, but engaging with all kinds of governments, including ones that are complicated. This is clearly complicated. And secondly, we're going to be holding ourselves and everybody to a single standard, that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And third, that we're going to do what we can to encourage a debate within societies, believing that it's very hard to impose change from outside, but where there is a civil society and news media and others, we're going to push for a broad definition of democracy that looks at rule of law, strength of civil society, independence of the press, and the like. And Russia clearly has those elements, the civil society and the media, but they are really under attack. And for us, I think, the challenge is at this moment where it's very hard to figure out what's the external pressure that's going to work, where's the leverage, and what are the things we ought to be doing to support those within Russia who are really being challenged on a daily basis. We had over the weekend 100 people demonstrating and arrested, some beaten up. This has now become a pattern. There's clearly a growing intolerance of dissent and the space closing, from my judgment, for what independent human rights activists, defenders can do, what the media can do, what lawyers can do, what journalists can do. There really is a challenge for us now. How do we step up and support the people that are pushing for human rights and democracy within Russia? That's our challenge.
Right.
I can't tell you I have the answer, but I'm painfully aware of both how important a moment this is for Russia and also struggling, honestly, and I'd be interested in thoughts for the places where we can exert the greatest influence. There's some places it's absolutely clear to me we have aid relationships, we have huge trade relationships, we have countries coming to us, and we know exactly what to say and do. This is a more complicated case.
Well, that's right. We were talking, before the conversation got started here tonight about, if one of the lessons learned, quote unquote, of the previous decade of U.S. engagement in Russia was that the Russians don't like to be lectured by the Americans. Well, what exactly does that leave you besides lecturing? As you point out, the level of aid is not, significant anymore. There's not a lot of day in and day out trade to focus on. This is a natural resource-based economy where Americans aren't even, don't even rate as serious customers. So that's one. And then two, how do you conceive of what the reset button has come to mean in terms of the U.S.-Russian relationship? Certainly some people have read that as offering Prime Minister Putin and President Medvedev, far more space to operate internally in Russia as they wish. A sense that the U.S. was really signaling with that a kind of realism, hands off, our interests stop at your borders kind of approach to Russia, which devalues human rights. I know that's your job institutionally to represent human rights, but how do you deal with critiques of the policy like that?
Yeah, I reject that because I think the key to our success in promoting U.S. national interest is that we are smart and we look broadly at a strategic approach to countries like Russia. We've got to be able to deal with Russia in terms of its role in helping us, let's say, put pressure on Iran. There's a whole range of foreign policy interests where we need to be talking to Russia and should be talking to them. But we've got to do that at the same time that we recognize the internal challenges and the fact that we do, as a country, support and ought to be supporting, a universal standard of human rights, and one that assumes that where there are people within the society trying to push for change, we ought to be figuring out how to help them. So we've got to be, reset doesn't mean forgive and forget. It means trying to figure out on parallel tracks or on multiple tracks how we pursue a range of interests.
So he just had a good question for you, Karina, which is what is a role that the U.S. could meaningfully play that would make a difference? Obviously, your client, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, had extensive contacts here in Washington before his arrest. In the end, it didn't make a difference.
Yes, and he met so many very influential people, and they gave him friendship. They offered him support, and they knew that he had many good ideas to create a very transparent and very modern company, which is on a level of the international standards of the including tax payment. And later on he was accused in a non-payment of tax, evasion of taxes, although the company paid huge amount of money as taxes, but they found a way to optimize the law provisions to reduce the tax payment, but solely on the basis of law. And all his charges are just false charges. And people knew here that he especially came to Russia in order to not be a person who escaped of justice. But he said, I would prefer to, even, nobody loves to stay in prison, but especially in Russian prison, I would say. But even I would prefer to be a political prisoner than political immigrant. And he was honest in that. And the authorities, while they couldn't threaten him and he returned back to country, they arrested him, and nobody, I hoped that somebody, many people would raise their voices in his defense. And at the very beginning, it was probably unclear, especially for normal American people, maybe he's guilty in something. The thing was strange. He was arrested with many violations of rights and things like that, and that he deliberately came to Russia to show that he's nothing to afraid of. But he didn't take into account that in my country for a long time, and he didn't know that, many people stay in prisons without real basis for their charges. He always thought that he will bring all his evidence in a court and he will win the case. That was, you cannot say he is naive, but that was when the person is sure I'm not guilty, why should he afraid or she afraid of? We were expecting the really strong voice from the United States. There was no, and that time administration did nothing. And now I'm looking for the Obama's administration involvement in all this. I realize it is difficult today to change this situation, but I still hope in that. Because, you mentioned many of my cases, and there are so many cases about people whose names nobody knows. But the practice shows that the most important test cases, as we call them, they are about famous people. Because you don't need to put all the business people in prison. You only have to put one, the most brave. And the rest of the business community would understand everything. You don't need to arrest all people in the street when they demonstrate their disagreement with the policy of the state. But if Garry Kasparov has been arrested, this is how he became not only my friend, but also my client. He was suddenly arrested. Even 5 days were enough for Amnesty International to decide he is a prisoner of conscience. You don't need to kill all the journalists, but just call the most brave, and rest of the community would accept this or do not accept this signal. And this is, you would ask me, the United States are so far from the Russian Federation. But this world became so small. And when you made your friends, made friendship with somebody, would you look at his principles and the standards, how he live, is he honest? the world looks with a big hope to Mr. Obama. I'm not a politician. I'm really out of the politics. But I have noticed that people look with a big hope to him. And I don't think it would be the best way for him to build the relationship with Russia, saying that our administration would not raise the human rights issues in our discussion with other countries. It would be just not clear why. And if you care about your friends, or if you care about the friend countries, you have to come to the all negotiations with a very sincere understanding or non-understanding of their actions, and you have to. I mean, let us take Anna Politkovskaya case. She was an American citizen, simultaneously been a Russian citizen. I still don't understand. If 3.5 years, the Russian authorities have failed to investigate properly and effectively her case, why the United States would not say, this is very important lady. She was a strong personality. We all, majority of good people of good will, they recognize her, encourage, and her impact in creating democratic standards in my country. Why the United States would not raise the point, if you have failed in that, we will give you our assistance. Maybe look at the same time another my client, Mr. Khodorkovsky. He was accused in doing things in favor of the United States. The coming
that's
treaty
part of
and
his
agreement. And he suffers as an enemy of country because he ostensibly did something in favor or going to do something in favor of the United States. Why the United States would not care about this person?
Can I ask one thing? You mentioned Anna Politkovskaya. I imagine that most people here know who she was, but she was really in many ways Russia's uniquely crusading journalist. She worked for Novaya Gazeta. She was pretty much a lone voice in uncovering the unbelievable sort of atrocities and abuses that took place in the war in Chechnya, as well as closer to home in Moscow where she lived. She was killed as she went back home into her apartment several years ago. It remains an unsolved case. There have been several other very high-profile killings, in recent years in the small community of Russian human rights activists and journalists who still pay attention to this sort of thing. Last year, many of you may have noticed the accounts of Natalia Yestimirova, for example, who was, probably the only major human rights person who was still living inside of Chechnya and working there. She was also just literally dragged into a car on the street in Grozny. Is that the biggest difference that you've seen over the last decade in Russia, the actual physical threat and people being killed? Are there other indications that you have of how it's become more difficult to practice law, for example? Have you learned things over the last 10 years that just wouldn't have happened 10 years ago?
Our International Protection Center were working without any hindrance, any problems, any attempts, just a few attempts to interfere, like to send in the request, what are you doing, and things like that. We just rejected all these attempts, and we were safe. But last 5 years, we cannot work. We always reply to some. We ourselves were accused in tax evasion. It's unbelievable. I mean, some of the foundations, internationally very well-known foundations in Western Europe and in the United States, including the National Endowment for Democracy, which supported some of our educational programs. Ford Foundation, Soros Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, we always receive this money, and we are not a non-profit organization. And to oblige us to pay taxes from profit, which is not profit, and it is just against the law, Russian law, that was just an attempt to threaten us. And when they have failed, they were trying to find another ways. Started investigation against me personally, that on the basis of the cases before the European Court, when I defend somebody and the court give me a kind of lawyer's fee, very small money, but I'm committing a fraud against, I mean, this, we would say this is absurd. But the second charge against Mikhail Khodorkovsky is such an obvious abuse that today even nobody thinks that these charges have some grounds. And I love President Obama, just an accurate phrase. It seems to be like a repetition of the first charge. It is even worse. It is even much easier. These are pure absurd charge, especially if you compare it with the first charge. I mean, whenever you have the necessity for the international solidarity, and I remember from my past education and from current education that the United States were very good always with this kind of solidarity in support of people in trouble and people dishonestly treated. You ask me how I'm working now. The authorities were trying to disbar me.
Right, I was going to mention that.
And the second time, they were very serious, unless the stupid phrase that I'm bad lawyer for Khodorkovsky. I do not give him a proper legal representation. That's why I should be dismissed from his case instead of his what he thinks about that, and from lawyer status generally. Can you imagine after 30 years practicing law? And I mean, that was if not 15 congressmen from the United States, led by, at that time, Mr. Lantos. Who knows how they would decide on that?
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that pressure still matters in a way. I mean, that's an interesting point, actually, about Congressman Lantos, who was obviously an incredibly active on all issues related to Russia. What do you see? Secretary Clinton recently gave a speech about, sort of internet freedom. Been a lot of talk about sort of how do you leverage the new tools that are at people's disposal, whether it's Twitter or Facebook. You obviously have many ways to reach out to people in Russia today, but in a way, it doesn't feel as though the U.S. has sort of figured out how to. The more you're able to reach people, that doesn't necessarily mean the more receptive a message is.
Yeah, it seems to me. I mean, we are. We're figuring out the best mix of tools. And I would say, to me, as I think about Russia, there's three pieces to that. One are these symbolic cases that really are larger than life, Estemirova and Politkovskaya. These are cases that people are paying attention to, and they're representative of a bigger thing than just one individual. The fact that even Mr. Orlov, the head of Memorial, is being gone after because he's raised the Estemirova case.
Yeah.
I think we need to find the right ways to identify a handful of cases and really keep pushing on it. We're starting to do that. That's part of what I think needs to be done. The second piece to me is what you're describing. We ought to be thinking, we are thinking, the Secretary's speech, I guess last week or 2 weeks ago at the museum, reflects the fact that the world is changing and the way people get information is changing. Mm-hmm. Both within Russia, there's a blogging community that are talking to one another, and they're talking to the rest of the world and listening to the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. We need to be creative, and aggressive in saying, and we are doing that through a range. We've got congressional support, there's money coming in, but there's also a piece here of diplomacy to make sure that there's a single internet open to all without the constraints on free expression and protection of privacy. We need to do both. But there is particularly a younger generation that are communicating this way and gathering information and delivering information. We need to be smart and aggressive in using that technology. And then the third piece to me, which is a longer term piece, but in some ways it fits in with the theme of this discussion, we ought to be looking at the kind of broader institutional changes that are needed. President Medvedev has talked about a rule of law being one of the pillars of a new Russia. Well, the rule of law is suffering in Russia. And so we ought to be thinking both with people outside the government and within, what does that mean? And what are the things that we can do in our bilateral relations, and what can we do with European allies and others to really reinforce the notion that stable, solid states that are going to succeed in the 21st century are states that have respect for the rule of law.
Can I press you a little bit further on what? Tell us what is the promotion of democracy in Russia part of your mandate right now? And if so, how do you think you can most effectively do that?
It is part of the mandate. And, again, the speech that in addition to the internet speech, the Secretary Clinton gave a speech at Georgetown last month, or in December, where she really laid out what I view as the Obama-Clinton approach to these issues, linking human rights, democracy, and development. And a lot of what I said at the beginning is it's based on a notion that we're going to engage. We're going to engage on a range of topics, but we're going to engage with a premise that these issues matter. We're going to take a universal standard, and we're going to try to apply it to build a strategy for democracy that isn't just about did somebody hold an election and are we monitoring what went on. That's a piece of it, to be sure, but empowering women, strengthening media, building rule of law, creating more transparency and accountability, again, issues that are very prominent in Russia, and strengthening civil society is part of that. I view this as a really important test case for Russia. It's a hard one. But some of the things we're talking about here, the restrictions on NGOs, for example, there's an epidemic of this. In the last year, 18 months, 28 countries in the world have imposed new laws or restrictions on NGOs, their right to organize, their right to be registered, their right to receive foreign funding.
28 countries.
28 countries. So, I was just in Egypt. The Egyptian government has said to AID, we're not going to tolerate funding of unregistered organizations. Well, guess what? The unregistered organizations are the ones that are critical of the Egyptian government. I see the same thing. China. The Chinese have entered a memo of understanding with AID. Again, the same subject. We want to control. We see it in Latin America. So I think there is a huge challenge for us, and it's it lands at my doorstep, to really recognize that governments are becoming more aggressive in trying to clamp down on independent action. And if we're serious about a commitment to democracy, we've got to take that on head on. Russia is a tough case. It's a big, important case. It's one of the places I think we're going to be judged.
Corinna, maybe you can't answer this, but do you see more or less presence of American officials, American pressure in the cases that you're involved with now than you did, say, 5 or 10 years ago? Have you noticed the Americans pulling back? Are they still occasionally show up at Hodorkovsky's trial in Moscow, for example? But
the trial is visited. Some of the American human rights organizations, especially in defense of the journalism, they contact me constantly. They are trying to find a way to push the government to investigate Paul Khlebnikov case, Anna Politkovskaya case. They're trying their best to find a way to use. last 2 years, many people in the United States who remain very indifferent to toward the sorry, the European Court mechanism, seeing, as well as we found it several years ago, that people are quite hopeless if they have known this mechanism as a last weapon. They are much more interested in having the using this mechanism and assisting us. Now, I had a proposal from many NGOs in the United States, including recently we had obtained a great support from the organization called International Senior Lawyers Project, which made a great research on some of our cases and helped us to plead these cases before the European Court of Human Rights. And if previously American lawyers are very much reserved when they was so enthusiastic in using the European Court mechanism, asking me, why do you do this? Let you exercise all your opportunities at the domestic court system. I would say if the person has the perspective to defend himself at the European Court, it's the highest instance of justice is the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation. You almost have any mechanism to push the government. Why they are so care about, for example, on the Politkovskaya investigation? Because they know that within the 6-month period after her murder, we filed our complaint. We have filed this complaint with the European Court, and they know that the European Court would not investigate, would not found those guilty, but they would found those responsible if the state has failed to protect her life, if there are some indications that something is really dangerous for her, and there was a kind of search for her, and they have failed to investigate effectively. If there is the result, then the country is responsible for the violation of right to life from the sense of from the point of positive obligation on right to life, and they know that. And they are trying to playing games. But while they are playing games, they still discover some information. And it is like one step by one. And when we have 3 American organizations supporting us in the researches on these cases, when they help us with the amicus career, we feel this support, it's easier to work. I can only judge from my professional side. Right. I cannot discuss the diplomacy and political things, not because I'm afraid of something. Just I'm not a specialist, and I hate when people are discussing something what they are not big specialists. And by the way, who in our center who wants to be very political, they are free to go, because it is much more difficult to approach our people, our lawyers, if we are staying solely on the legal issues, on the legal points, and then how can you just stop us? I don't know. I don't want to.
I want to just jump in here on the European Court,
Yeah.
because I think it's an important piece of this. You said earlier, and it's right, that over 30,000 cases are now pending at the European Court involving Russia, a lot of them from the North Caucasus. And one of the challenges has been for the European Court that there's so many cases that they keep the backlog of cases. There are over 100,000 cases overall. And the backlog keeps growing every month. And one of the things they've tried to do is to make the procedure more streamlined. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it was the Russian government that was resisting that. Well, they've recently, this is through something I think called Protocol 14, they've recently indicated that they're willing to sort of free the bottleneck and create smaller panels to review the cases. I regard that as an important development. I think part of what we want to do is create a sense that there's a global concern about this. There's a European court, which is part of the, it's what people in Europe do. They go to the court as a court of last resort. If it's not functioning or it's got a backlog that means nothing ever gets resolved, then you lose that as a weapon or as a remedy. So I think it's very important. These cases to me are very important, and they again suggest that this is not just the U.S. or another country imposing its values. This is a collective response from the states of Europe, a legal response. And Russia is part of that exercise. It's brought itself into that exercise. And now I think we have to hold that system up and strengthen it. Of course, we're not part of Europe, but we ought to be encouraging that to happen. And maybe there are things we can do indirectly. But I think that's a very important piece of the architecture here. There's some things that can be done in Russia, some things that can be done on a bilateral basis. But this European side of it and European legal side, I think is probably underappreciated, but a really important piece of how you make change.
And may I defend my authorities?
Please.
It's quite unusual for me, but I will. The Russian authorities realize their commitments. They know about their responsibility. They know for sure that all the judgments are binding, and they always pay compensations
if they're ordered.
in all cases where the European Court decided this, and even they are trying, at least trying, to implement the judgments in sense of the measures of general character. It's difficult to find in Chechen cases, unfortunately. And the more cases we have, it's now more than 100. Only in Chechnya, it's about even 150. And in these cases, you can say, what have they done? They haven't started the investigation, or if they started, this is more imitation than real activity. But in cases about the prison conditions, about torture, what they are doing, they are presenting to the Committee of Ministers. We have in the Council of Europe very effectively working body which check all the implementation of the judgments. And they bring each 3 months the report how they implement all the judgments. So they are trying to follow their international obligations. It's huge. I mean, of course, the cases for all these years decided only 800 with something. But even I would mention one of my cases, and that was the first public hearing at the European Court of Human Rights, Kalashnikov versus Russia, about prison conditions, about the length of the pretrial detention. Since Kalashnikov, so many people had a success with the European Court and without the European Court, because when they mentioned with the penitentiary authorities about Kalashnikov, everybody immediately realized that this is, again, already the case law. And in many prisons, the conditions have been dramatically changed. Unfortunately, the conditions remain very poor, but at least the authorities know what does it mean, that they are responsible, and they somehow react on that. And they were very honest to prepare the big pack of documents to bring to the European Court to say how many prisons they have repaired, new built prisons with other conditions, improving the conditions for the prisoners. I mean, this is something. And again, in the cases where the implementation of judgment of the domestic court takes sometimes 1, 2, 3 years, in these cases, they passed a new law. By the way, if the European Court found that somebody is the victim of unfair trial, We have a provision in Russian criminal procedural code to retrial this case, and they are doing that. So it's quite unusual for me to say what the Russian authorities are.
But in
doing
effect, you're
wrongly.
saying this is a tactic that has teeth, that does, matter to the Russian government in a way that some of this other stuff perhaps does not. I think this is a perfect point to invite the audience to start to ask some questions as well. We have a microphone back here, and I'll just ask you to say who you are and where you're from, right here towards the front.
Kathy Cosman, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I had a question about the religion cases before the European Court. As far as I understand, with one exception, although the Russian government does pay monetary compensation in cases where it's lost, it has not implemented the rulings of the court. And I also had a question about the famous Russian-American civil society dialogue. Why did the governments get involved in the dialogue? Why couldn't it have just been civil society groups from each side coming up with their own recommendations and making recommendations to the governments? I think that would have been a more honest way to proceed.
Thank you, especially for the second question. This is my question to the both authorities. We would like to be involved. We have almost the place to discuss something with the government. They do not notice our existence even, only when they want to put us in jail or somewhere else. But concerning the first question, all the judgments on the freedom of religions have been implemented, and you probably would say that the pattern remains the same. But I would argue that we would have huge amount of the cases on freedom of religions if there is no self-restriction of the government, which know pretty well the well-established practice of the European Court. They know the standards, and so they, in many cases, just stop their pushing these questions because they know they will certainly lose the case.
Do you want to say something?
On the civil society dialogue, let's just say it's a work in progress. One of the things I realized, I haven't ever worked in government, and I got in, and all of a sudden I realized that there are literally dozens of these dialogues. And I'm not convinced it's the best way to make change. You have to have a clarity of purpose. What are you trying to accomplish coming out of it? Mike McFaul, who leads this for the U.S., is certainly very committed to human rights and democracy. His counterpart on the Russian side is Mr. Surkov, who has certainly a different perspective, I would say. And the dialogue, at least as it is now, is going to focus on some issues where there's some common discussion, like on corruption, perhaps. I agree with you. I think if we're serious about a civil society dialogue, it has to include civil society. But there's got to be a buy-in on both sides for that, and we're not there yet. So I think we probably need to kind of go back to the drawing board. That is what it is, but we ought to be trying to think about ways in which, beyond, the president visits Moscow or the secretary, and there are meetings with civil society, that's not sustainable. And so we've got to find some ways, I think, to create more space for civil society in Russia and for a genuine dialogue about issues that matter to civil society there and here.
Great. Here on the aisle.
Thank you. My name is David Nikradze. I represent Georgian Broadcasting Company, Rustavito in Washington, D.C. As I remember, there is a case in European court about the deportation of Georgians from Russian Federation. Many people have been deported, even these people who had employment authorizations and legal status, immigration status in Russian Federation. So I was wondering to ask you, are there any new developments on this case, and how would you comment Russia's government's decision to deport Georgian citizens because of the political situation? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I just, before the United States, I was in Georgia, in Tbilisi, nearby Tbilisi, in Bakuriani, and I gave some lectures for the Georgian lawyers how to use the international courts, including the European Court of Human Rights, and we had an unforgettable time discussing all these questions. But concerning your question on the particular case, which I had the honor to present at the hearing, that was a quite rare situation of intergovernmental case, and I loved the position which Georgian government took in this case. They said, we don't ask about the compensations, although it would be quite fair. We don't say about even somebody to be punished for all these things. What we ask for the European Court, just to recognize the violations, and it is impossible in the international practice and in internal practice that these events could ever be repeated. That is a very, very high position taken by the Georgian authorities. We still are waiting for the judgment. It's not been passed yet, but I think, I don't know, I would not predict the judgment, but it would be of utmost importance. You're right.
Michael Marshall, UPI. I'd like to ask about the state of the Russian judiciary. In the article from Mr. Politkovskaya that Susan read at the beginning, he presented a rather, I would say perhaps rosy picture of the independence of the judiciary 10 years ago. I mean, it seems now that the whatever elements in the authority, in the political authorities, if they decide to go after somebody, they concoct a case, and they seem to be able to do it with pretty great confidence that there's not going to be a lot of resistance from the judiciary. Yep. Is that true? Are there any prospects of a more independent judiciary? And has there been a decline in independence, or is it really just a kind of leftover culture from the Soviet period? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. It's a very painful question. You are working as a defense counsel, and your profession completely killed because nobody wants to listen to your points. And if you have the strongest case, you would lose it because the judiciary is not independent. Of course, I will repeat again, the type of, the sort of cases which we have, they are very specific. People come to us when they have no anything to lose. If they still have the chance to ask about the human approach, the sympathy, or they can negotiate, or they can bribe the judges, they do not come to us. They come to us when they know we have no anything to lose. So we have very specific kind of cases. But this is maybe can be characteristic for 15%, maybe 10% of all cases. Even they are less, it is still the test cases. The judiciary can be tested only with the principal cases, not the cases when somebody committed a hooliganism or killed somebody and come to the judge saying, please give me not 15 years imprisonment, but 12 years imprisonment. And this is not a lawyer's case. The lawyer's case is when you have a good point to oppose against the charge, to prove somebody's innocence, and you failed just because the judge is not allowed to decide your case differently. You say this is from the Soviet period. I would never say like this because we have almost no old judges. But these new judges, they have a very certain background. They came, all of them, from police, or from procurator office. This is almost never people with lawyer's background. So the approach is always accusatory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Karana, we reported a few years ago, and you might have the updated information. Even today, with legal reforms and all that sort of thing, that the conviction rate in Russia is still 99%, and I believe that that's still the case today.
That is what I was going to demonstrate. You very unsuccessful if you want to prove the lack of independence of judge in every single case. But taking these rates, no, Susan, it's not 1%. It's even not 0.5%. It's less. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine? Mm-hmm. And so there is no what we call, according to the European Court terminology, equality of arms. You always see that Procuratura dominates in all the case hearings. Mm-hmm. And we know that they not only dominate over the defense, but over the court itself, the judges. And it is difficult to discover because the judicial community, first of all, is very closed. And second, judges are the less protected people in Russian system. They even cannot go to the European Court of Human Rights to say we were dismissed. I was dismissed unlawfully. The only case, and this is new, probably opportunity. The only case where the European Court accept the judge complaint is Kudeshkina versus Russia, woman, and you should remember it from your Russian time.
Yeah, we wrote about it.
Olga Kudeshkina was so brave when he was pushed in one of the high-profile case on corruption. She went to the media to say that they dismissed me from this case to be a presiding judge. And after that, she was dismissed from her office. And the Russian authorities were so sincere that they recognized that they dismissed her only because after 18 years of very high standard work, they dismissed just because she was naughty in this case. And because she disseminated this information on public. And the European Court once, the first time, decided that this was unproportionate, that this is the sanction on her freedom of expression. And since that time, our Russian judges know that they have a right to freedom of expression. It's important.
I wonder, Michael, how many countries in your portfolio have conviction rates of 99% or over?
Too many.
Yeah, exactly. This gentleman here has wanted to ask a question.
Stephen Morris, Johns Hopkins SAIS. I have a question about American foreign policy. In 1996, an American businessman was murdered on the streets of Moscow as a result of a dispute with his Russian, or shall we say Chechen, business partner over ownership of the Radisson Slavyanskaya Hotel. We know that the person who gave the order to murder this American businessman was his business partner, a man of Chechen origin. And we know because Mr. Putin's election team in 2000 publicized this fact. Yet this man still functions in Russia and is in the media quite often. I assume he doesn't have a visa to enter the United States. But in this case, and I think in many others where murder is involved, not only of American citizens, but of prominent Russians, would it not be a fair thing to do for the United States not only to bar entry of these known criminals, but also to work with their European allies? And the reason why this is very important is because all of these criminals invest their money in places like London, Spain, and the south of France. And they don't particularly care if they can't come to go to Las Vegas because they've got plenty of opportunities in these other places in Europe. Therefore, it becomes very important for the United States to coordinate with its allies to make these criminals social pariahs around the world. Would you be willing to tell me what American policy is in this regard, and perhaps pursue such a policy?
Well, first of all, I'd like to get the details of that case, if you can, give them to me. It's much easier for us, American policy. American policy starts with the notion that we will give particular attention and we have standing, so to speak, in cases involving American citizens. When I was in NGO 25 years ago, we represented the families of 4 American nuns that were killed in El Salvador. We were able to, as an NGO, as a human rights activist, I was able to do a whole lot of things to push the United States to pay attention to justice issues in El Salvador because the victims were American. And so if this is a case 10, 15 years old now involving an American citizen as a victim, it's exactly the kind of case that gives me the opening to...
His name is Paul Tatum.
You can. I'd love to get... We can talk right after.
Very well known.
Yeah, but I'm glad to... I'd actually like to start to collect some of these cases and see if there isn't a way to use them as a way into the discussion.
Okay, great. I see a hand back there. I can't quite see.
It's Heather Marr with Radio Free Europe. The question is for Assistant Secretary Posner. Earlier, when you were asked about what the Obama administration is doing to promote democracy in Russia, you said, I view this as a really important test case, Russia, a hard one, and you said that the U.S. will be judged. Could you explain what you meant by Russia as a test case? For what exactly, and what's at stake when you say we will be judged if the United States gets it wrong?
Well, I think I meant a couple of things by that. One, obviously, Russia is a major power, major country in the world and in Europe. It's a country that has a long-standing pattern of human rights violations that we've dealt with historically. And it's a place where I think there are challenges today because the nature of our relationship is one that we don't have, as we were talking about earlier, the easy, clear trade or aid relationships that makes it easy for us to influence or provide, have leverage. So I think it's both an important country, and it's an important country where we've got other interests, but more importantly, where it's a challenge to figure out the right way to actually influence the debate. We can't do it alone. We've got to work internationally with European and other allies. But we are, I think, on the spot here to try to figure out what's the way to really be effective, both in supporting people inside the country that are trying to push for human rights and democracy, and externally trying to create the kind of climate where these things are taken seriously.
Hi, excuse me, Robin Levy with Alston & Bird. This question is mostly for Mr. Posner. I'm wondering if the administration's considering bringing up human rights issues in discussions regarding the START Treaty or WTO accession or other aspects of the bilateral relationship.
Yeah, again, to say that the United States government is not a monolith is an understatement. There are all sorts of different people trying to figure out what to do with Russia in all kinds of contexts. My job, as I see it, is to make the case that a strategic relationship with Russia or any country has got to include human rights and democracy as an essential element. Whether or not it means that by that I don't mean that we ought to, make everything dependent on a human rights and democracy policy. We obviously have a huge interest in pursuing the START and getting a resolution of the arms control issues. We have a huge interest in dealing with Iran. There are a range of things where the U.S. and Russia have and should continue to discuss ways in which we can cooperate. But that does not mean that we take these issues off the table. These issues are too important to Russia, and they're too important to our broader notion of what a stable globe looks like. If a country has a stable democratic structure and rule of law, and it's respecting the rights of women. It's respecting the rights of civil society. It's going to be a better partner on the whole range of issues that we're dealing with. And we're not there. We have a big agenda with Russia. Human rights and democracy have got to be part of that process.
Sorry, just to follow up, does that mean that human rights has been raised in the context of the START conversations?
Well, you know, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not part of those discussions. It's certainly my conversations with people who are involved in the broader range of discussions with Russia is to say we've got to be able to do these things at the same time. It doesn't mean that every discussion about START has a human rights moment. It does mean that we have to take a three-dimensional view of U.S.-Russian relations and say that we've got to find opportunities, and more than just me, to be raising the human rights issue. And so part of my job is to be looking for natural allies and looking for opportunities to raise these issues in a way that has meaning.
Okay. All the way in the back there.
Hi, I'm an attorney here, do some civil rights work, and I'm just the rule of law is really interesting to me, and I'm wondering. Thank you very much for coming. I'm wondering if you fear for your safety for coming and speaking like this. I know that the journalist who came to speak to the Jamestown Foundation was dead within a year, and I just also wanted to see whether you felt like there was a general perception of a distrust in the judiciary or lack of faith, or if your sentiments are pretty much prevalent throughout the country that people don't trust their judicial system.
The clear indication of their trust to their judicial system is a big backlog of the Russian cases filed with the European Court of Human Rights. You know, of course, many people go there with clearly inadmissible cases because they want, for example, to prove their innocence. It is not the court for proving innocence, but without having anything else, they still go and they will continue going. And the Russian authorities realize that. They realize that this is a test of the condition of their judiciary. That's why they want to reduce number of the cases filed with the European Court, and not with improving the situation in judiciary, but trying to find the way to stop people. If they are in prison, they are explained that nothing would happen with their complaints. If they now they are looking for the way to create the next instance for the Russians to have to spend one more year using these remedies, so-called remedies, because they are not effective. But the European Court strong case law says you are not obliged to use ineffective remedies. You can go immediately after the exhaustion of the effective remedy. I don't know how much is the effective the court procedure with this rate of acquittal judgments, if we say, for example, about the criminal cases. And how much important is the cassation? It is the second level of the hearing of the court. But at least your complaint or their complaint create the obligations of the Russian judiciary to hear the case, to have this case on the deliberation. But the third instance, which is judicial supervisory judicial review, not what we call nadzorная инстанция, it's not an effective remedy, but they are looking for the ways to impress the European Court that this is now with no new law. It became more effective, and the Russian people have no right to go to the European Court because it is supplementary remedy unless they exercise all the possible things in their country. But, you know, this is the huge amount of complaints from the Russian Federation, and they could be even more and more. This is a clear demonstration of the distrust, disbelief, which Russian people showed or demonstrate toward their own judicial system.
Can I just jump in here for one word? I think when we've talked a lot tonight about the some of these high-profile test cases. I think when we talk about the rule of law, one of the things that is most interesting to me is the extent to which President Medvedev has actually been pushing this as an essential piece of Russia emerging in its own right as a country that isn't subject to corruption, that has a more predictable system for trade, that deals with personal family disputes. The rule of law covers a whole range of things, a lot of which I think at least the president has decided are in fact in the Russian national interest. We ought to be reinforcing that. We ought to be watching that closely. I think it's part of the reason that they've come in the way that they have to the Council of Europe, to the European Court. There's a sense that this is a set of ground rules. These are rules of the road for dealing in the 21st century global economy and global political space. These test cases are the hardest in some ways, but you can't just cherry pick. You can't have the rule of law for some and not others. So I think we ought to view this as an opportunity. It's one of the pieces of the future discussion where I think, in fact, we can reinforce things that are being said domestically in Russia and try to figure out ways that we can amplify and accelerate that process.
Hi, my name is Karen Latty, and I'm with the Institute for Gulf Affairs. This question is directed to Mr. Posner. On the topic of human rights violations and disregard for international human laws and regulations, I would like to bring to your attention a case which has been brought to the attention of past U.S. officials for several years now, but has received no action. It's regarding somebody called Hadi al-Mutif, who is the longest-held religious prisoner in the world today, held for over 17 years on false charges, mainly in solitary confinement with the death sentence in Saudi Arabia. I would like to know what course of action do you plan on taking to secure the release of Hadi and grant him asylum in the U.S., as you did with Chinese religious prisoners such as Rabia Kadir?
Again, with all due respect, I don't know the case. I'm glad to get the details. There are a range of cases that my office deals with relating to religious persecution. Part of my trip in Egypt a couple weeks ago, I was dealing with the Nadia Hamadi killings of the Coptic Christians earlier in January. These issues come up in a range of countries. I'm glad to look at this case and get back to you, but I just don't know the details of it.
Okay. I think we have time for just about one more question, if we can. This gentleman here.
My name is Nikolai Rudensky. I work for a Russian online publication, Kremlin and currently I am a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. And I have a question for Mr. Posner. So you mentioned this Russian-American Commission on Civil Society, chaired, as you said, by two persons with somewhat different perspectives on democracy and human rights. And as far as I know, back in December, there was a letter signed by some 70 U.S. congressmen to the administration, well, kind of commenting on that difference in perspectives and actually calling on the government to look whether Mr. Surkov is all right as co-chairman of that commission. So would you, I don't know about any reaction from the administration to that letter, so could you kindly comment on that? Thank you.
Well, I haven't seen the letter, although I can imagine what it says. But, I guess what I would say is let's not get too hung up on one or another vehicles for getting to the end we want to reach. I would say right now the civil society dialogue is what it is. It's going to take its own course. It may turn into something that's more directly related to the issues we've been talking about here tonight, or it may not. It shouldn't stop us from pursuing this agenda. And so, you know, you sort of have to take these things as you find them. You have to deal with, we didn't get to nominate the Russian interlocutor, but that doesn't mean we're going to stop talking about human rights and democracy or looking for ways to advance that agenda. So I think we have to be creative, we have to be resourceful, and we have to be persistent. And we have to make it clear that these issues matter to the United States, they're going to continue to matter, and we're going to continue to press.
All right, one more, and then we're really done.
My name is Andrei Larionov. I'm from the Kate Institute, and my question to Mr. Posner. You have mentioned Mr. Medvedev as a person who is trying to achieve the higher level of rule of law in Russia. But many Russians do have problems with this understanding of Mr. Medvedev. Just recently he has called the regional election last October in Russia as absolutely going in accordance with the law, which is definitely is a mockery. Just early on, last August year 2008, Mr. Medvedev has sent Russian troops abroad, violating international law, sending them into Georgia. This is a huge violation of international law. Early on, Mr. Medvedev has been elected with a huge violation of the Russian electoral law to be as a president. Actually, he was not elected. He was appointed, as you know. So the question is, what kind of achievements you would like to get dealing with the person who has such a wonderful background in some kind of bringing country to the rule of law?
Well, this question sort of takes us back to where we started the discussion. And the question really at the beginning was, you know, where do you exert influence? How do you actually change behavior or create pressure, as it were, for a more human rights, democracy-oriented government? We start where we are. What I was saying a few minutes ago, and clearly from my comments tonight, there is a long list of things on the human rights docket that where we have a lot of work to do. But I also, what I said a few minutes ago is that you start by taking a look at what public officials say, and you try to see, is there an opening presented by those comments? The fact that there is a position of the president that one of the pillars of moving forward is the rule of law provides an opening for some conversations. It doesn't mean we're going to have exactly the same appreciation of what that term means. It doesn't mean we're not going to have disagreements as we do over fairness of elections. It doesn't mean that we're going to say we're satisfied with the way the rule of law is being applied today. It simply means that there is a platform or a basis for a discussion where there are Russian officials saying it's in our interest to promote the rule of law. Let's get in there and be part of that discussion. It's a long-term prospect, but it seems to me that there is some opening here that we ought to be taking advantage of.
If only I'm made to add something to what Mr. Larionov mentioned, and you started with this, that Mr. Medvedev cares about the rule of law, and he said about the impossibility to remain in the legal nihilism. And after all, he answering the question of journalists and international journalists, when they ask if this administration is going to release Khodorkovsky, and this gentleman, our president, who graduated from the same Leningrad State University, which I was graduated, and Mr. Putin, by the way, as well, he said, being a lawyer, that it is impossible to release Mr. Khodorkovsky on amnesty because he must accept his guilt. And this is completely against the. This is a clear demonstration of legal nihilism. If you plead guilty, and this is the only condition and the only possible way to be released, it means that those who are really not guilty, they have no. They have no chance. It is a real discrimination to those who are, for example, in jail because of their judicial mistake. So, and giving advantage to those who are maybe not guilty, but admitting they're guilty, and this is clear legal nihilism. Another lawyer, Mr. By education, Mr. Putin, in some his presentations, mentioned that Khodorkovsky is responsible for some bloody crimes, on which we even didn't know what to respond. This man completely doesn't know anything about the presumption of innocence. And all these speculations were so strange for the lawyers that my client, Mr. Khodorkovsky, raised this point at the trial, and he said, this man knows something what you, judge, don't know. Let him come to the trial. Let him be a witness. Anyway, I was going to call him as a witness, and the prosecution refused me, and the court is going to let him come and give the witness statement and be responsible for his wording. So legal nihilism in our country starts with those lawyers who rule my country, or maybe somebody else rule my country. I wonder who rules my country.
Well, I think that's an appropriate note to end on. I want to thank both of you very much for a terrific and important conversation here today. Karen, thank you.